Fog crawls up from the Hudson River, threading through terraced gardens where sculptures catch moonlight. The stone mansion rises 6 stories on the highest point in Pocantico Hills, its 40 windows dark except for security lights that cast long shadows across marble fountains. A classical villa built in the style of Italian palazzos, but the proportions are wrong, deliberately asymmetrical, as if the architect kept changing his mind mid-construction. 2 basement levels burrow underground with passages that still connect to 70 other buildings scattered across 3,000 acres. The coach barn stands 3 times larger than the house itself, filled with carriages that carried men who controlled 90% of America's oil. Sarah Winchester built endless corridors to confuse ghosts. John D. Rockefeller built an empire state where protesters once marched with rifles and anarchists plotted bombings, all because of what happened in a Colorado tent colony when his company chose profits over lives. Was Kykuit a refuge from guilt or monument to immunity? If you're fascinated by Gilded Age estates and the untold stories behind America's most notorious properties, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me which historic mansion or industrial site I should investigate next. Your support keeps these deep dives coming. Thanks for being here. Let's begin. The newspapers called John D. Rockefeller the world's richest man, and in 1893, when he first purchased land in Pocantico Hills, the statement carried mathematical certainty. Standard Oil controlled more than 90% of petroleum refining in the United States. The wealth accumulated through methods that would later be deemed illegal. But in the final decade of the 19th century, the Supreme Court had not yet intervened. Rockefeller's brother William had already built Rockwood Hall nearby, a 204-room mansion that stretched across 1,000 acres. John D. saw the Hudson Valley and recognized strategic value, high ground overlooking the river, far enough from Manhattan's crowds, but close enough to maintain control of the empire headquartered at 26 Broadway. He began quietly, the way Standard Oil had swallowed competitors, purchasing 17 farms one by one until he controlled 3,500 acres of hillside and valley. The sellers didn't know who was buying until documents were signed. Local families who had worked the land for generations found themselves relocated, their homes demolished or converted into residences for the army of gardeners, security guards, and laborers who would maintain what came next. Rockefeller moved into the Parsons Wentworth house in 1893, sharing upstairs rooms with his adult children and their spouses while construction plans took shape. The house was temporary. What he envisioned required architectural ambition that matched his business empire. The Parsons Wentworth house burned down on September 17, 1902. The New York Times noted that Rockefeller had never trusted the electrical wiring, which predated modern safety measures. He had ordered workers to reroute the wires into conduits, work planned to begin the day after the fire preempted it. The loss was estimated at $40,000, equivalent to over $1 million today. The fire accelerated construction of what would become Kykuit, the Dutch word for lookout, positioned at the highest point where fog never lingered and visibility extended for miles. The fire taught Rockefeller something about control and vulnerability. Wealth could purchase land, architects, materials, labor, but it couldn't eliminate risk. Electrical systems could fail, wood could burn, staff could make mistakes. The new house would require redundancy, backup systems, fire suppression that went beyond standard measures. He became obsessed with details that most estate builders delegated entirely to contractors. Every electrical conduit would be inspected personally. Every heating duct checked for clearance from combustible materials. Every exit route mapped with alternatives. The paranoia that served him well in business, anticipating competitors' moves and blocking them, translated into architecture. Build so nothing could go wrong. And if it did go wrong, build so you could escape. That mindset shaped Kykuit's infrastructure in ways visitors don't see. The basement tunnels that diverted delivery trucks also provided evacuation routes. The multiple staircases, more than a 40-room house typically requires, allowed egress from any location. The underground passages connecting to staff buildings created a network where security guards could move unseen, responding to threats without alerting intruders to their approach. The telephone lines, some buried underground, others strung through tunnels, ensured communication even if surface lines were cut. This wasn't merely a wealthy man's country estate. It was a fortified position designed by someone who understood that great wealth creates great targets. But this was not a man who built impulsively. Between 1893 and 1905, 12 years passed while Rockefeller calculated exactly what statement his country estate should make. Too ostentatious would invite criticism in an era when muckraker journalists like Ida Tarbell were publishing devastating exposés about Standard Oil's practices. Too modest would suggest weakness at a time when industrial titans competed through architectural excess. The Vanderbilts had built the Biltmore estate with 250 rooms. Carnegie had Skibo Castle. Rockefeller would build something different, a 40-room villa that appeared restrained at first glance but revealed its power through position and precision. In 1905, he delegated the project to his son, John D. Rockefeller, Jr., who was then 31 and already managing aspects of the Standard Oil empire from offices at 26 Broadway. Jr. hired architects Chester Holmes Aldrich and William Adams Delano to design the initial structure. They proposed a steep-roofed three-story stone mansion, T-shaped to capture Hudson River views and afternoon sunlight. Rockefeller Sr. wanted an office and drawing room at the entrance, a large central space, a library, tea room, and dining room. He described it as a comfortable domestic refuge. Jr. had grander plans. Construction began in 1906 on a 500-foot knoll. The foundation required excavation that revealed bedrock, which engineers used to anchor the structure against winds that swept across the exposed hilltop. Local fieldstone was quarried from the property itself, weathered gray and cream that would blend with winter skies. The original design called for simplicity, but as walls rose, disagreements emerged. Sr. wanted restraint, Jr. wanted architecture that commanded respect. His wife, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, wanted interiors that could accommodate visiting dignitaries and display art collections. The architects found themselves mediating between three visions. By 1907, the basic structure was complete, but Rockefeller Sr. refused to move in. The proportions felt wrong. Rooms were too small for their intended purposes. The heating system failed to account for hilltop winds that penetrated walls and windows, creating drafts that made winter occupancy uncomfortable despite massive radiators. Plumbing leaked from joints that hadn't been properly sealed, staining newly plastered walls. The electrical wiring, installed with modern conduits after the Parsons Wentworth fire, somehow still malfunctioned. Lights flickering during storms, circuits overloading when too many devices operated simultaneously. Noise from delivery trucks rattled beneath Sr.'s bedroom window, waking him at dawn when suppliers arrived with produce, milk, meat, coal, all the materials required to operate a household that functioned like a small hotel. Jr. ordered a tunnel dug underground to divert traffic. The excavation required months of work, laborers with pickaxes and shovels removing tons of rock and soil, engineers calculating angles and drainage to prevent flooding, masons lining the tunnel with brick and concrete that would last generations. That tunnel still exists, wide enough for trucks, tall enough that men can walk upright, stretching from service buildings near the property's edge to the mansion's basement, allowing deliveries to arrive unseen and unheard. The tunnel work revealed another issue. The bedrock that anchored the mansion's foundation extended irregularly across the property, creating pockets where soil was shallow and other areas where excavation hit stone 3 feet down. Building the carriage roads Jr. envisioned would require constant adaptation to terrain, blasting through some hills, building up other sections with filled dirt, creating culverts for drainage when spring rains turned paths to mud. The property wasn't naturally suitable for the network of elegant drives Rockefeller imagined. It would need to be engineered into suitability, yard by yard, at costs that accumulated beyond any preliminary budget. In 1908, they started over, not demolition, but radical renovation. William Wells Bosworth, who had been designing the gardens, took control of the architecture. Bosworth had studied at MIT and the École des Beaux-Arts, then worked on restoration of the Palace of Versailles and Notre Dame de Reims, projects partially funded by Rockefeller money. He understood how to balance classical European elegance with American expectations of newness and efficiency. He added a fourth floor, redesigned the east facade, expanded the basement into 2 full levels with secret passages and storage for an art collection that didn't yet exist but would. By 1913, Kykuit was complete. 6 stories total if you counted both basements, 40 rooms, 36,000 square feet, small by Gilded Age standards, but the gardens would tell the real story. The gardens consumed 7 years and cost over $1 million, exceeding the original $30,000 budget by a factor that made even Rockefeller blink. Bosworth created terraced levels descending the hillside, each with its own character and purpose. The inner garden featured fountains and sculptures, classical figures positioned to catch light at specific hours. The west terrace opened to Hudson River views, with balustrades and pavilions for outdoor dining. The Japanese garden, inspired by a trip Jr. and Abby took to Kyoto, featured streams, waterfalls, ponds, and a Shinto shrine. The Oceanus Fountain, a replica of Giambologna's 16th century original from the Bubbly Gardens in Florence, dominated the forecourt. Initially, the Olmsted Brothers firm handled landscaping. Sr. was unhappy with their work and assumed personal control, transplanting whole mature trees, designing lookouts, and creating several scenic winding roads that serpentined through the property. The roads were the tell. 70 miles of private carriage roads eventually connected Kykuit to every corner of the estate. They weren't simple paths, but engineered routes with stone walls, water features, bridges designed by Charles W. Stoughton, who had previously worked on the Bronx River Parkway. The roads progressed through open fields and meadows alongside ponds over ridges. They connected Kykuit to the coach barn, to the playhouse, to the 75 houses where staff lived, to the farm complex, to William Rockefeller's Rockwood Hall property which John D. absorbed after his brother's death. The roads allowed Rockefeller to survey his domain on horseback or in carriages, inspecting every acre, ensuring nothing occurred without his knowledge. The estate employed hundreds. Gardeners maintained the terraces, replacing flowers seasonally, trimming hedges into geometric perfection, pruning trees to maintain views, raking gravel paths smooth every morning. Security guards patrolled day and night, particularly after 1914 when threats became real. Armed men walking the perimeter, checking credentials of anyone approaching, monitoring the single access road that wound up from the valley. Laborers operated the farm that supplied food, planting vegetables in spring, harvesting in fall, maintaining dairy cattle that provided milk and butter, chickens for eggs and meat, pigs for slaughter. The estate aimed for self-sufficiency, producing as much food internally as possible, reducing dependence on outside suppliers who might be unreliable or whose delivery trucks might wake Rockefeller Sr. at dawn. The staff lived in 75 houses scattered across the property, each assigned based on job and family size. Head gardener got a larger house than assistant gardeners. Security chief's residence exceeded ordinary guards' quarters. The hierarchy was precise and visible. Housing quality signaled rank within the estate's private economy. Some staff had worked for the Rockefellers for decades, generational employment where fathers trained sons in gardening techniques or security protocols, families whose entire identity connected to maintaining this hilltop domain. They were paid better than many similar positions elsewhere, Rockefeller understanding that loyalty required compensation that discouraged workers from seeking employment with other wealthy families. But the pay came with expectations of absolute discretion. What happened on the property stayed on the property. Visitors who came and went, conversations overheard, business conducted in home offices, all of it remained confidential. Staff who violated that discretion found themselves unemployed without references, blacklisted from other estate positions, their betrayal making them unemployable in the tight network of wealthy families who communicated about problem workers. The coach barn, completed in 1914, stood 3 times larger than the mansion itself, a massive structure housing horse-drawn carriages, sleighs for winter, automobiles, as they replaced horses for transportation. The collection eventually included 12 antique family automobiles, documenting how the wealthy adopted each new automotive innovation. A 1903 Winton, one of the earliest automobiles the family owned. A 1914 Crane Simplex, luxury vehicle, when trains still dominated long-distance travel. A 1925 Rolls-Royce, symbol of ultimate automotive prestige. The vehicle sat in climate-controlled storage, maintenance staff ensuring engines remained functional even though most were never driven, preserved as historical objects rather than operational transportation. The Playhouse, finished in 1927, also dwarfed the main house, a French Norman-style building positioned next to the 9-hole reversible golf course. Its ground floor featured an indoor swimming pool tiled in elaborate patterns, basketball gym with polished wood floors, squash court with walls reinforced to withstand ball impacts, billiard room with imported tables, bowling alley with lanes maintained to professional standards. The second floor contained guest suites for family members visiting from other properties, bedrooms appointed with furniture equal to the main house. Outside, an outdoor pool overlooked the Hudson River, tennis courts with clay surfaces that required daily maintenance, gardens that connected to the larger network of terraced levels. The golf course itself was an engineering achievement, 9 holes that could be played in reverse, creating an 18-hole experience without requiring the full acreage traditional courses demanded. Greens were maintained with obsessive attention, grass cut to precise heights, sand traps raked smooth after every use, water hazards monitored for proper depth and clarity. Rockefeller had negotiated with the Putnam Railroad to reroute their tracks 5 miles away so coal-burning locomotives wouldn't shower soot across the course during play. The rerouting cost money and required political influence to override the railroad company's preferred route, but such obstacles were trivial for a man who controlled industries and shaped markets. By 1911, Standard Oil's net value was estimated at $375 million. After dissolution that year, Rockefeller owned a quarter of the shares in the 34 successor companies. As those companies' values doubled, his personal wealth grew rather than diminished. The Supreme Court had ordered the breakup, but mathematics made him richer. The question of how that wealth was generated couldn't be separated from Kykuit's terraces and fountains. Standard Oil had controlled 90% of refining through methods detailed in Ida Tarbell's 19-part series in McClure's magazine, starting in 1902. Her father had been an oil producer whose business failed because of Rockefeller's dealings, bankruptcy that left the family struggling while Standard Oil accumulated unprecedented profits. She spent years investigating, conducting sympathetic interviews with Henry H. Rogers, a Standard Oil executive who provided information that later appeared in her exposés, Whether intentionally or believing she wouldn't publish damaging details remains unclear. Tarbell documented secret railroad rebates that gave Standard Oil rates far below what competitors paid, making it impossible for smaller refineries to ship profitably. She detailed predatory pricing strategies where Standard Oil would temporarily lower prices below cost in specific markets to drive local refiners out of business, then purchase their facilities for fractions of their value once bankruptcy became inevitable. She revealed espionage networks where Standard Oil employees gathered intelligence on competitors' production volumes, customer lists, and business strategies, using that information to undercut deals and steal clients. The company bought out failing refineries through what appeared to be legitimate business transactions, offering cash to desperate owners who had no other buyers. But the desperation was manufactured. Standard Oil created the conditions that made those refineries fail, then acquired them at distressed prices. By 1879, it controlled more than 90% of refining capacity in the United States. The trust formed in 1882 pooled securities of 40 companies into a single holding agency managed by 9 trustees, valued at $70 million at inception. In November 1906, the Justice Department sued Standard Oil of New Jersey for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. The trial lasted 15 months, testimony filling courtrooms in St. Louis, where the case was filed. The government filed a 12,000-page report documenting 40 years of practices that purposefully and illegally excluded competitors, a voluminous indictment covering everything from railroad rebates to targeted market manipulation to threats against suppliers who did business with Standard's rivals. More than 2 years were occupied in taking testimony under a special examiner at various cities throughout the country. John D. Rockefeller himself was among those examined, sitting for depositions that revealed his direct knowledge of practices that courts would rule illegal. In May 1911, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that Standard Oil had illegally monopolized the petroleum industry and ordered dissolution into separate companies. Chief Justice Edward Douglas White wrote that the company had engaged in unreasonable restraint of trade, violating the Sherman Act through practices that raised prices, reduced output, and lowered quality, the 3 consequences that defined monopolistic behavior under the new rule of reason standard. The decision split Standard into 34 independent companies, including Standard Oil of New Jersey, which became Exxon, Standard Oil of New York, which became Mobil, Standard Oil of California, which became Chevron, and dozens of other firms that would later merge and recombine into the major oil companies still operating today. Justice John Marshall Harlan concurred with the result, but dissented against adopting the rule of reason, arguing that the Sherman Act should ban all restraints on trade, not merely unreasonable ones. His dissent predicted that the rule of reason would create loopholes allowing monopolies to escape prosecution by claiming their restraints were somehow reasonable. History proved him partially right. The rule of reason did create interpretive flexibility that companies exploited. But the Standard Oil dissolution stood, the trust broken on paper, even if its component parts continued operating in familiar, coordinated patterns. Rockefeller was already retired from management. The dissolution happened on paper, legal separation of entities that continued to operate in familiar patterns. The stock Rockefeller held across all successor companies made him wealthier than when Standard Oil was unified. He had become, by 1913, when Kykuit was completed, America's first billionaire. Worth approximately $1.5 billion when he died in 1937, equivalent to roughly $23 billion today, adjusted for inflation. That number doesn't capture power. It doesn't account for influence that could reroute railroads or suppress labor organizing or ensure governors deployed state militias to protect company interests. The money that paid for Kykuit's marble fountains and Japanese gardens didn't come from oil alone. It came from the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, which Rockefeller Sr. had purchased controlling stake in during 1902, then transferred to Jr. in 1911. CF&I employed approximately 7,000 workers and controlled nearly 70,000 acres of coal-rich land in southern Colorado. The company operated mines where, in 1912, the death rate was 7.06 per 1,000 employees, more than double the national rate of 3.15. Explosions, suffocation, and collapsing mine walls killed over 100 men that year alone. Miners worked in conditions that made death statistically predictable. They were paid only for coal brought up, not for time spent reinforcing tunnels or improving safety. They were charged for essential equipment and safety provisions. Housing was company-owned, prices set by the company, eviction possible at any moment. The United Mine Workers of America presented demands in September 1913. Enforcement of the 8-hour workday Colorado law supposedly mandated the right to choose their own housing and doctors, recognition of union representation, and fair weighing of coal to ensure accurate payment. The demands were refused. On September 23, 1913, approximately 11,000 miners went on strike across southern Colorado. company guards immediately evicted striking families from company housing. The United Mine Workers helped them set up tent colonies in the hills, the largest at Ludlow housing about 1,200 people, families living in canvas through autumn cold, then winter cold that reached below zero. The Colorado National Guard was deployed, ostensibly to keep peace. The Rockefellers supplied the Guard's wages. What miners initially thought was protection revealed itself as enforcement. The Guardsmen beat miners. They arrested hundreds. They rode horses through parades of women in Trinidad. They escorted strikebreakers into the mines under cover of night. Still, the strike held through winter. By April 1914, extraordinary measures were required to break it. 2 National Guard companies stationed themselves in hills overlooking the Ludlow tent colony. Some accounts say guardsmen demanded the miners turn over a hostage. Others say no demands were made before gunfire began. Nobody knows who fired first, but on the morning of April 20th, 1914, the National Guard opened sustained fire on the tent colony. The battle lasted throughout the day. Women and children hid in cellars they had dug beneath their tents for protection against bullets that had been strafing the camp for weeks. 3 strike leaders, including labor organizer Louis Ticas, were captured and killed, anecdotal evidence suggesting Ticas had been lured out to discuss a truce before being shot. As strikers ran out of ammunition, they retreated into surrounding countryside. In the evening, National Guard troops soaked the tents in kerosene and set them on fire. A telephone linesman going through the ruins the next day lifted an iron cot covering a pit in one of the tents. Beneath it lay the charred, twisted bodies of 11 children and 2 women. They had suffocated and burned to death while hiding from the gunfire above. 21 people died at Ludlow that day, though reports vary between 19 and 26 depending on which casualties are counted as direct versus indirect. The children's names were documented. Rudolph Valdez, age 9 months, Frank Petrucci, age 3, Joe Petrucci, age 4, Lucy Petrucci, age 6, Onofrio Bartolotti, age 2, Patria Valdez, age 4, Elvira Valdez, age 3, Mary Valdez, age 7, Eulala Valdez, age 8. The names of all 11 were recorded. The names of the 2 women, Sedelia Costa and Alcarita Pedregone, were recorded. Their deaths were not abstract statistics. They were people with faces, documented in coroner's reports and newspaper accounts and union records that named every child. News spread immediately. In Denver, 5,000 people demonstrated in rain on the state capitol lawn, demanding that National Guard officers be tried for murder, denouncing the governor as an accessory. The Denver Cigar Makers Union voted to send 500 armed men to Ludlow. Women in the United Garment Workers Union announced 400 volunteers as nurses. Across Colorado, armed miners attacked anti-union officials, strikebreakers, and mines, taking control of an area 50 miles long and 5 miles wide. As many as 50 additional people died in the violence that followed. The exact count lost to chaos. Railroad workers refused to transport soldiers. 300 Union miners walked off jobs in Colorado Springs and headed for Trinidad carrying revolvers, rifles, shotguns. President Woodrow Wilson sent federal troops on April 28th to restore order. Unlike the Colorado National Guard, federal soldiers were impartial and kept strikebreakers out of the mines. The strike officially ended December 10th, 1914, with workers gaining almost nothing in terms of tangible benefits, though the UMWA gained 4,000 new members and the massacre sparked nationwide labor reforms. Congress directed the House Committee on Mines and Mining to investigate. Their 1915 report influenced child labor laws and 8-hour workday legislation. The Ludlow site, 18 miles northwest of Trinidad, is now a ghost town with a monument listing the names of the dead. The blame was specific. Colorado Fuel and Iron Company was controlled by John D. Rockefeller Jr. from offices at 26 Broadway in New York. He had testified before a congressional hearing on April 6, 1914, 2 weeks before the massacre, defending the company's open-shop policy and stating that he would stand by company officers at any cost, even if it meant losing all property and killing all employees. After Ludlow, he told congressional investigators he had trusted company officials' statements about what took place and had not read testimony from the coroner's jury. When shown a photograph of Frank Snyder, a boy killed while, according to witnesses, playing with his sister, Rockefeller declined to look. He later claimed there was no Ludlow massacre, that the engagement started as a desperate fight for life by small squads of militia against the entire tent colony, that no women or children were shot by authorities or company representatives. Protests erupted in New York. Demonstrators picketed 26th Broadway, the Standard Oil headquarters where Rockefeller Jr. maintained offices and where decisions about Colorado labor policy were made. Signs condemned him as murderer of children, monster who prioritized profits over human lives, capitalist whose greed burned families alive. A minister protested in front of Rockefeller's Baptist church where the family worshipped, holding a sign that read "The blood of Ludlow stains these steps," and was clubbed by police who arrested him for disturbing the peace. The minister's beating made newspapers, photographs showing police dragging him away while other churchgoers looked on, creating sympathy for protesters and embarrassment for the Rockefellers, who found their place of worship transformed into a protest site. Alexander Berkman and Carlo Tresca, anarchist leaders already notorious for previous violence, organized marches through Manhattan. Berkman had served 14 years in prison for attempting to assassinate industrialist Henry Clay Frick in 1892, stabbing and shooting Frick in his office, though Frick survived, and Berkman's hoped-for uprising never materialized. Now he saw Ludlow as the catalyzing event that could finally spark working-class revolution. When Junior fled 30 miles upstate to Kykuit, protesters followed, though police and private security prevented them from reaching the property itself. They marched on public roads nearby, chanting, carrying signs, making their presence known even if they couldn't breach the estate's boundaries. That's when the bomb plot began. On July 4th, 1914, 3 members of the anarchist Red Cross and 1 Industrial Workers of the World member were constructing a bomb in an apartment at 1626 Lexington Avenue in East Harlem. The apartment belonged to Louise Berger, an editor of Emma Goldman's Mother Earth magazine, who had left for the offices on 119th Street that morning. The 3 men, Charles Berg, Carl Hansen, who was Berger's stepbrother, and Arthur Karen, were assembling dynamite obtained from Russia, large quantities stored in the 6th-floor apartment while they constructed the explosive device intended for Rockefeller's Tarrytown home. At 9:15 in the morning, the bomb exploded prematurely. The blast destroyed the top 3 floors of the 7-story tenement, furniture thrown hundreds of feet through the air, glass shards raining onto streets below, residents of surrounding buildings thrown from their beds by the concussion wave. Charles Berg was torn into pieces, limbs and torso separated by the explosive force, body parts witnessed by horrified spectators being thrown through the air onto the streets where they landed amid smoking rubble. Carl Hansen died instantly, his body found in the apartment's wreckage, mutilated beyond easy identification. Arthur Karen was blown onto the building's fire escape, the metal structure twisted and buckled by heat and force, his corpse tangled in the wreckage. Marie Chavez, who had merely rented a room in the apartment and knew nothing about the bomb-making, also died in the explosion, an innocent victim whose misfortune was living in the same space where conspirators built weapons. 20 other people were injured, 7 hospitalized with severe burns, broken bones from falling debris, lacerations from flying glass, traumatic injuries from being thrown across rooms or downstairs by the blast wave. Another IWW member named Mike Murphy had spent the night in the apartment and was still in bed when the dynamite detonated. The bedroom floor beneath him was destroyed, the bed falling through to the apartment below. Miraculously, he walked away with minor injuries and loss of some clothing, then disappeared before police could question him about his knowledge of the plot. The Lexington Avenue explosion ended the immediate threat to Kykuit, but bomb plots continued throughout the summer and into the following year, indicating how deeply Ludlow had radicalized segments of the labor and anarchist movements. In November 1915, a gardener at the Tarrytown home of John D. Archbold, president of Standard Oil, found 4 sticks of dynamite hidden in a rut in the driveway, each stick weighing 1 pound, wrapped together with wire, fitted with percussion caps, concealed with paper matching the driveway's color. The positioning was calculated, placed exactly where Archbold's automobile would pass when he returned home. The weight and subsequent impact of the vehicle on the driveway intended to trigger the percussion caps and detonate the explosives beneath him. Police defused the bomb and theorized it was planted by anarchists and IWW radicals as protest against the execution of IWW member Joe Hill in Salt Lake City that same month, though direct connection was never proven. The sophistication of placement suggested someone with knowledge of Archbold's routines, his typical arrival times, which entrance he preferred. The bomb's camouflage indicated planning rather than hasty action. Whoever planted it understood that detection meant failure and designed the device to remain invisible until detonation. The discovery reinforced what Rockefellers already knew, that their wealth made them targets, that labor conflicts in Colorado created enemies willing to pursue violence in New York, that security required eternal vigilance and resources most families couldn't afford. The New York City Police Department inaugurated its bomb squad within a month of the Lexington Avenue explosion. Kykuit had become a fortress by necessity. The 75 houses for staff included residences for security guards who patrolled with weapons. The network of private roads allowed rapid response to any intrusion. The property's elevation and isolation provided natural defense. Visitors who came by appointment were shuttled up the long, winding drive that crossed the golf course. Marked at the base by large iron gates, the tunnel system beneath the house provided escape routes if needed. Rockefeller Sr., who moved into Kykuit in 1913 at age 74, would live there until his death in 1937, spending winters in Florida and summers on the hilltop overlooking the Hudson, maintaining routines of privacy and control. But the terraced gardens and classical sculptures couldn't erase what funded them. The juxtaposition was stark. 11 children suffocated in a tent pit, while the man whose company ordered the kerosene walked through Japanese gardens with transplanted mature trees. 2 women burned alive while their employer discussed interior design with Ogden Codman Jr., America's leading decorator, who filled Kykuit's first floor with 18th century style furniture and Asian ceramics. 21 people killed at Ludlow, while marble fountains were installed replicating Florentine originals. The timeline makes it impossible to separate beauty from blood. Jr., for his part, eventually hired William Lyon Mackenzie King, former Canadian Commissioner of Labor, to develop what became known as the Rockefeller Plan, a system of company-sponsored unions designed to undercut the United Mine Workers and avoid another violent strike. It created the appearance of worker representation while maintaining company control. Jr. also became a philanthropist, funding restoration of colonial Williamsburg, donating land for the United Nations headquarters, supporting medical research and education. Whether that constituted atonement or reputation management depends on perspective. The Ludlow massacre remained the defining event that forced public acknowledgement of labor's cost. Kykuit itself evolved through generations, each adding layers that transformed the estate from Senior's refuge into something more complex and contradictory. After Rockefeller Sr.'s death in 1937 at age 97, having lived longer than most men of his era and accumulated wealth that exceeded most nations' treasuries, Jr. lived in the house until 1960. He had demolished his own home, Abington Lodge, which stood elsewhere on the property, choosing to occupy his father's estate instead, maintaining the routines and spaces where Sr. had spent his final years, perhaps seeking connection to a man whose approval had driven much of Jr.'s life. In 1961, ownership passed not to the eldest son, John D. Rockefeller III, who was the rightful heir by tradition and birth order, but conceded the property to his brother Nelson in a family negotiation that recognized Nelson's particular attachment to the estate and his vision for its future. Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, who served 4 terms as New York governor between 1959 and 1973 and became vice president under Gerald Ford from 1974 to 1977, transformed Kykuit into a showcase for 20th century art that rivaled museums in scope and quality while remaining a private residence where family gathered and political strategy was discussed. He kept the original furniture that Sr. and Jr. had selected with Ogden Codman's guidance, respecting the classical European aesthetic they had chosen. The Chinese ceramics that Jr. had collected remained displayed in cabinets and on shelves throughout the house, delicate porcelains from various dynasties representing centuries of artistic achievement. Portraits of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington stayed on the walls where Sr. had hung them, visual connection to the historical and political legacy he most admired and identified with, seeing himself as inheritor of their vision for American greatness, even as labor activists saw him as betrayer of democratic ideals. But Nelson added more than 70 works of modern sculpture to the gardens, transforming Bosworth's classical terraces into outdoor galleries where 20th century art dialogued with 18th century landscape design. Henry Moore's bronze abstracts sat alongside Baroque fountains. Louise Nevelson's assembled wood structures contrasted with marble balustrades. Pablo Picasso's figurative pieces occupied positions where they caught morning or evening light. Alexander Calder's mobiles moved in Hudson River winds. David Smith's welded steel constructions introduced industrial materials into formal gardens designed for aristocratic contemplation. Constantine Brancusi's polished bronze reflected sky and clouds. The juxtaposition was deliberate, Nelson understanding that art's power came from unexpected placement, modern challenging classical, abstract confronting figurative, industrial intersecting organic. The underground basement, which Sr. had designed for storage and utilities, and Jr. had used for wine and practical purposes, became a major art gallery displaying Nelson's collection of Picasso tapestries. Enormous woven works based on Picasso's paintings covered walls in climate-controlled rooms where carefully managed lighting prevented fading, where humidity and temperature were monitored constantly to preserve textiles that represented investments worth millions and artistic achievements worth more than money could measure. Works by Andy Warhol hung in adjacent galleries, pop art's commercial aesthetic juxtaposed with Picasso's modernism, creating conversations between artistic movements and philosophies. Marc Chagall's dreamlike images occupied another space, floating figures in vivid colors creating atmosphere distinct from Warhol's ironic detachment or Picasso's formal experimentation. Alberto Giacometti's elongated sculptures stood in corners and alcoves, their attenuated forms creating presence through absence, bodies reduced to essential lines that somehow conveyed more humanity than realistic representation. The collection represented not merely acquisition of valuable art, but genuine curation, Nelson's eye selecting pieces that worked together while maintaining their individual power, creating a whole greater than the sum of extraordinary parts. He agonized over precise placement of outdoor sculptures throughout the property, spending hours considering how each piece would interact with landscape and architecture and changing light, how Henry Moore's abstraction would appear when viewed from the terrace above versus the path below, how Calder's mobile would move in prevailing winds, how Picasso's bronze would catch afternoon sun. He converted the coach barn's lower floor into a modern conference center while preserving the collection of carriages and antique automobiles above. He encouraged his two sons to become collectors, proudly displaying their bottle collection alongside his blue-chip art. The estate became a private museum long before it became a public one, art and history layered across terraces and galleries. Nelson died in 1979, bequeathing his one-third interest in the estate to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. His brothers Lawrence and David later did the same with their portions. In 1976, Kykuit was designated a National Historic Landmark. Renovations. In 1995, by architect Herbert S. Newman, reconfigured spaces to accommodate public tours, converting third and fourth floor staff quarters into guest suites, updating infrastructure to handle group visitation. Today, Historic Hudson Valley operates tours that depart from a visitor center at Phillipsburg Manor in Sleepy Hollow, shuttling tourists up the long drive that once carried men who controlled empires. Much of the land has been donated to New York State, including the Rockefeller State Park Preserve, where the public can ride horses, bike, jog across 70 miles of carriage roads. Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture, established in 2004 by David Rockefeller in memory of his wife Peggy, operates a nonprofit farm and education center on 79 acres, selling organic produce to the adjacent Blue Hill restaurant. The Rockefeller Archive Center, a 3-story underground bunker beneath the foundations of Martha Baird Rockefeller's former Hillcrest mansion, houses more than 150 years of family papers, accessible to researchers. The Playhouse still hosts family meetings twice yearly. 10 Rockefeller families continue to live within the estate boundaries, though most of the 3,500 acres are now public parkland. The coach barn, 3 times larger than the mansion, still holds the collection of horse-drawn carriages and 12 antique automobiles, documenting how transportation evolved alongside the family's power. Walking through the barn's dim interior, you can see a lineage of vehicles that carried Rockefellers from one property to another, from Kykuit to Rockwood Hall to the farm complex to the Playhouse, a private transit system across an empire estate. The Playhouse Gymnasium and bowling alley sit empty most of the year, preserved as evidence of excess, a French Norman-style building larger than many hotels, constructed solely for family recreation. Tours are not permitted to photograph the interior of the main house, a restriction that creates interesting tension between access and control. The public can walk through rooms where Rockefeller Sr. made decisions that shaped American industry, reading newspapers at a breakfast table while contemplating railroad rebates or competitor buyouts. They can stand in Junior's office where he consulted with architects about marble selections while miners died in Colorado, telegrams arriving with updates on the strike while he debated fountain placement with Bosworth. They can view Nelson's private galleries where he displayed art worth millions while the massacre's legacy remained largely unaddressed in public memory or institutional acknowledgement. But they cannot capture those spaces digitally, cannot take photographs that would allow later review or sharing on social media or creation of personal archives. Memory becomes the only record available to ordinary visitors, forcing them to absorb rather than archive, to experience the weight of history rather than reduce it to images that can be viewed without presence, liked without understanding, shared without context. The restriction serves practical purposes, protecting art and furnishings from flash damage and discouraging theft by preventing detailed photographic documentation of layouts and valuables. But it also maintains an element of exclusivity, a reminder that even as public museum, Kykuit retains private character, access granted as privilege rather than right. The guides who lead tours are professional and knowledgeable, trained in art history and architecture and landscape design, and Rockefeller family biography. They describe the Oceanus fountain's provenance and Bosworth's design philosophy, and Nelson's relationships with various artists. They explain how rooms were used, which family members preferred, which spaces, how gatherings would flow from entrance hall to drawing room to dining room to terrace, patterns of domestic life among people who could afford to make pattern into perfection. They discuss the Chinese ceramics dynasties and the furniture's provenances and the portrait's significance. And what they rarely discuss is Ludlow in any detail beyond brief acknowledgement that labor relations were complicated. What they don't mention is the 11 children's names, or how kerosene-soaked tents burned, or why anarchists tried to bomb the property, or what Standard Oil did to achieve 90% market control, or how Colorado miners died at double the national rate. Those facts exist in historical records accessible to anyone willing to research, but they don't feature prominently in the official narrative presented to visitors who pay admission and board the shuttle van from Sleepy Hollow, who come to admire beauty and glimpse how wealth shaped lives, who don't necessarily want to leave feeling implicated in systems of exploitation or questioning whether admiring the estate constitutes endorsing the methods that built it. The gardens remain impeccable. Gardeners still replace flowers seasonally, trim hedges, maintain fountains. The terraces descend the hillside in precisely engineered levels, each offering a different perspective on the Hudson River Valley. From the highest terrace, you can see for miles on clear days, the Palisades across the river, the New York City skyline distant to the south. The position gives strategic advantage, the ability to observe without being easily observed, to control access through elevation and distance. That was always the point. Kykuit was never just a house. It was a statement about who held power and how thoroughly that power could shape landscape and law. The numbers tell one version of the story: 40 rooms, 6 stories, 36,000 square feet, 3,500 acres of property assembled from 17 farms, 75 houses for staff, 70 miles of private carriage roads, gardens that cost over $1 million when the budget was $30,000. A coach barn 3 times larger than the house, a playhouse 3 times larger than the house, a 9-hole reversible golf course, fountains, pavilions, sculptures, tunnels, secret passages. Estimating the total construction cost in modern dollars becomes difficult because values compound. But conservative estimates suggest the estate consumed the equivalent of hundreds of millions in today's currency, possibly over $1 billion when you include land acquisition, roads, infrastructure, staff housing, and ongoing maintenance. But that version omits the other numbers. 90% of petroleum refining controlled by Standard Oil at its peak. 7.06 deaths per thousand Colorado fuel and iron employees in 1912, double the national rate. 11,000 miners on strike in September 1913, 1,200 people living in the Ludlow tent colony, 21 people killed on April 20th, 1914, 11 children suffocated and burned, 2 women dead in the same pit, 3 anarchists killed when their bomb exploded prematurely, 20 others injured in the Lexington Avenue blast. 34 companies Standard Oil was dissolved into, Rockefeller owning shares in all of them, emerging wealthier than before dissolution. The juxtaposition of those numbers, construction costs versus human costs, reveals the mathematics of empire. Every fountain at Kykuit represents labor extracted from workers who never saw profit. Every terrace embodies refined oil sold at monopoly prices. Every sculpture purchased with wealth, accumulated through practices the Supreme Court ruled illegal. Every private road built with money that could have improved mine safety or paid fair wages or honored the 8-hour workday that Colorado law mandated but companies ignored. Some say Kykuit demonstrates what America's industrial age could achieve when capital and vision aligned. They point to the architectural excellence, the art collection now accessible to the public, the parkland donated for common use, the philanthropy that flowed from Rockefeller wealth. They argue that the estate's preservation serves educational purposes, teaching visitors about Gilded Age excess in 20th century art and landscape design. They note that Nelson's donation to the National Trust reflected democratic values, opening private luxury to public appreciation. Others say Kykuit stands as monument to exploitation, beauty purchased with blood, a physical manifestation of how the rich insulate themselves from consequences, while workers die in tent colonies or mine explosions or tenement bombings. They point to the 11 children's names, to Louis Tikas lured out for a truce, then shot, to the women who suffocated while hiding from bullets, to the families evicted in winter cold for demanding safe working conditions. They argue that no amount of donated parkland or art galleries can erase what funded the construction, that every guided tour should begin with Ludlow's casualty list, that forgetting those deaths to admire marble fountains constitutes historical erasure. The truth likely exists in the space between those interpretations. Kykuit is both architectural achievement and evidence of cost. The gardens are genuinely beautiful and genuinely built with money extracted through methods that killed and exploited. The art collection has legitimate cultural value and was purchased with wealth accumulated through monopoly that the Supreme Court dismantled. The Rockefeller family's later philanthropy genuinely improved education and medical research and was funded by the same industrial practices that created conditions requiring workers to strike for basic safety. History doesn't resolve into simple moral categories. It accumulates in layers, each era adding complexity. The estate that began as Rockefeller Sr.'s Hilltop Refuge became Jr.'s architectural statement, then Nelson's art showcase, then a National Trust property, then a public museum. Each generation reinterpreted what Kykuit meant, what it represented, what legacy it should preserve or transform. But beneath every interpretation lies the foundational question of how the wealth that built it was generated and what human cost that generation required. Walking through Kykuit today, tourists photograph the Hudson River views from terraces designed by Bosworth. They admire Picasso sculptures positioned by Nelson. They tour rooms where Ogden Codman's interior design created 18th century elegance. They learn about 4 generations of America's wealthiest family and their contributions to art, conservation, philanthropy. The guides are professional and knowledgeable. The experience is educational and aesthetically impressive. What they rarely discuss is Ludlow. What they rarely mention is the 11 children's names, or how kerosene-soaked tents burned, or why anarchists tried to bomb the property, or what Standard Oil did to achieve 90% market control, or how Colorado miners died at double the national rate. Those facts exist in historical records accessible to anyone willing to research, but they don't feature prominently in the official narrative presented to visitors who pay admission and board the shuttle van from Sleepy Hollow. The archives exist. The Rockefeller Archive Center's underground bunker contains papers documenting everything, business correspondence about strike policies, testimony from congressional hearings, financial records showing where money flowed. Researchers can access it all. The family didn't destroy evidence. They preserved it, possibly believing that complete documentation provides its own defense, that transparency about methods demonstrates nothing to hide, that history will judge them fairly when all facts are available. But preservation and presentation differ. Preserving documents in an archive requires researchers to seek them out, to spend hours in underground bunkers reading correspondence. Presenting those facts on public tours, in interpretive materials, in the narrative visitors receive, requires deliberate choice to center uncomfortable history alongside architectural beauty. Most historic house museums struggle with that balance. Some emphasize the beauty and minimize the blood. Others foreground exploitation and risk overwhelming visitors with guilt that overshadows appreciation for what remains. Kykuit's current presentation leans toward the former approach. The tours emphasize art, architecture, landscape design, family contributions to public life. They mention Standard Oil's founding, but not the monopoly details or 1911 dissolution. They discuss Junior's philanthropy, but not Ludlow. They celebrate Nelson's art collecting, but not the source of wealth that funded purchases. It's not dishonest, exactly. Everything stated is factual. But selective emphasis shapes understanding, and visitors leave with admiration for gardens and sculpture collections, without confronting the mining families whose suffering enabled that beauty. Perhaps that's inevitable. Public history sites depend on visitors willing to tour and donate and recommend the experience to others. Confronting audiences with massacres and monopolies and child deaths creates emotional weight that many people visit historic estates to escape. They come for beauty, for glimpses of how the wealthy lived, for gardens and art and architecture. They don't necessarily want to leave feeling complicit in systems of exploitation or questioning whether admiring the estate constitutes endorsing the methods that built it. But the children's names deserve mention. Rudolph Valdez, Frank Petrucci, Joe Petrucci, Lucy Petrucci, Onofrio Bartolotti, Patria Valdez, Elvira Valdez, Mary Valdez, Eulala Valdez. The 2 Petrucci boys were brothers. The 4 Valdez children were siblings. They died together in a pit under a tent, while guards employed by a company owned by the man who built Kykuit soaked canvas with kerosene and lit it on fire. That fact doesn't negate the Oceanus Fountain's beauty, but it should sit alongside it, neither erased nor overemphasized, simply present as part of the complete story. The question remains what Kykuit represents a century after completion. Is it a refuge, as Rockefeller Sr. intended, a hilltop retreat from Manhattan pressures, where the richest man in America could walk through gardens without crowds pressing close, where he could golf without strangers observing, where he could control every sight line and sound and maintain the isolation that great wealth both permits and requires? Is it a statement, as Junior designed it, demonstrating wealth and taste through restrained elegance that avoided the gilded excess of Vanderbilts or Carnegies, proving that true power doesn't need to shout, that 40 rooms on a hilltop with gardens costing millions said more than 200 rooms trying too hard? Is it a museum, as Nelson envisioned, sharing 20th century art with the public in settings most museums couldn't match, sculpture gardens with Hudson River views, underground galleries with climate-controlled preservation, Picasso and Moore and Calder accessible to anyone willing to pay admission and board the shuttle, democratizing access to art that remained technically private property but functioned as public resource? Is it a memorial, though not officially designated as such, to the costs of empire building, a physical manifestation of how monopoly capital and labor exploitation translate into landscape control and architectural achievement, beauty purchased with methods the Supreme Court ruled illegal and practices that killed workers demanding safe conditions? Is it evidence that survives when individual memories fade, stone in gardens and archives documenting an era when industrial titans accumulated wealth at scales that made them effectively sovereign, operating beyond meaningful government constraint, shaping markets and suppressing competition and crushing labor organizing, until progressive reformers and muckraking journalists and Supreme Court decisions finally imposed some limits on power that had grown too concentrated? Is it all of these simultaneously, meanings layered and contradictory and impossible to reduce to single interpretation, requiring viewers to hold multiple truths in tension, acknowledging both beauty and blood, both architectural achievement and human cost, both genuine philanthropy and genuine exploitation. The estate exists in present time, maintained by National Trust funding and Rockefeller Brothers Fund, support and admission fees from tourists, preserved as meticulously as when family occupied it, perhaps more so given that museum standards require documentation and conservation that private residences can ignore. Security lights still illuminate the 6-story stone villa at night, creating shadows across facades where Bosworth balanced classical and modern, where proportions were calculated to convey permanence without pomposity. Fountains still run according to seasonal schedules, water systems maintained by specialists who understand the engineering Bosworth designed, pumps and filters and controls that keep water circulating through marble basins, cascading over sculpted figures, creating sound that masks wind and traffic and reminds visitors that wealth could command even water to perform. Gardens still bloom with flowers replaced by professional gardeners who follow planting schedules developed over decades, ensuring something colorful appears in every season, spring tulips giving way to summer roses, giving way to autumn chrysanthemums, constant renewal that requires constant labor, invisible work that makes landscape appear effortless. The Hudson River still flows past the property, visible from terraces where visitors stand and take selfies with valley views, attempting to capture beauty that photographs never quite convey, the scale and position and atmosphere reducing to images that lack the presence of being there, standing where Rockefeller stood, seeing what they saw, though seeing it differently given changed contexts and knowledge of what funded the view. The carriage roads still wind through donated parkland where joggers and cyclists travel paths once reserved for family use, 70 miles of engineered routes with stone walls and bridges and carefully graded slopes that make the hills seem gentler than they are, landscape manipulated to create the illusion of natural perfection. The coach barn still houses carriages and automobiles, preserved vehicles sitting in exactly the same positions decade after decade. A museum within a museum documenting transportation evolution alongside family history, showing how the wealthy moved from horse-drawn elegance to automotive power, always a step ahead of common trends, adopting innovations early because money made early adoption risk-free. The playhouse still stands, mostly empty except for twice-yearly family gatherings, 3 times larger than necessary for any recreational purpose. Its gymnasium and bowling alley and swimming pools, testament to an era when private leisure facilities exceeded most public amenities, when wealthy families built what small towns couldn't afford, normalizing excess through routine use. And in Colorado, a monument stands at the Ludlow site, marking where a tent colony burned. The children's names are listed, the massacre is commemorated. Labor historians study it as a seminal event in American industrial relations. But the connection between that tent colony and the hilltop estate remains largely unmade in public discourse. 2 sites separated by geography and maintained by different entities, with different interpretive missions, linked only by those willing to research how Rockefeller money flowed from Colorado coal through 26 Broadway offices to Pocantico Hills construction contracts. The mathematics of empire don't appear on Kykuit's tour materials. The cost per child's life doesn't calculate on any plaque. The ratio of garden expenditure to worker wages exists only in archives. The correlation between monopoly profits and marble fountains requires visitor initiative to establish. The estate presents itself as art and architecture, not as evidence or memorial. That choice reflects what most Americans prefer when they visit historic sites: beauty over blood, admiration over accountability, the comfort of gardens over the discomfort of graves. But history accumulates whether we acknowledge it or not. The fog that crawls up from the Hudson River touches terraces built with monopoly money. The moonlight that illuminates sculptures catches stone paid for by practices the Supreme Court dissolved. The security lights that keep the estate safe at night echo the guards who patrolled after anarchist bomb plots. The silence that settles over the property in winter carries echoes of children's voices from a tent colony 3 states away, suffocating while hiding from bullets, burned while their mothers tried to shield them, killed by guards whose wages came from the same fortune that transplanted mature trees and installed fountains and hired architects to redesign facades until proportions satisfied. Some truths can't be resolved, only held in tension. Kykuit is beautiful. Kykuit is blood-bought. The gardens deserve admiration. The children deserve remembrance. The architecture represents genuine achievement. The monopoly required genuine dismantling. Nelson's art collection enriches public culture. Standard Oil's practices enriched one family while impoverishing competitors and workers and consumers. The National Trust's preservation serves educational purposes. The preserved estate embodies systems that killed. These facts coexist. They don't cancel each other. They complicate each other. They demand that anyone who admires the Oceanus fountain also remember Frank Snyder, the boy killed at Ludlow while playing with his sister, whose photograph Rockefeller Jr. declined to view when shown by congressional investigators. They require that anyone who walks through Ogden Codman's interior design also visualize the two women who died in a pit, Sedelia Costa and Alcarita Pedregoni, their names recorded in coroner's reports that Rockefeller Jr. testified he hadn't read because he trusted company officials' statements. What remains is stone and gardens and art and archives and memories and choices about which stories to tell. Kykuit stands on the highest point in Pocantico Hills, fog threading through terraced levels, sculptures catching light, fountains running according to schedule, security lights creating shadows across marble, tours departing from visitor centers, researchers reading documents in underground bunkers, joggers following carriage roads through donated parkland. The estate persists, maintained and preserved and accessible, its meanings multiple and contested, its beauty undeniable and its funding source documented, its gardens open and its foundational costs largely unmentioned. The question isn't whether to preserve Kykuit. Preservation serves legitimate purposes, protecting architectural and artistic heritage. The question is what narrative accompanies preservation, what context frames the beauty, what responsibility exists to name the children who died so gardens could bloom. That question extends beyond one estate to every historic site built with exploited labor or monopoly profits or imperial extraction. How do we appreciate beauty while acknowledging cost? How do we admire achievement while remembering victims? How do we preserve history without sanitizing it? There are no perfect answers. Only choices about emphasis and inclusion, about which facts to foreground and which to relegate to archives, about whether tours prioritize comfort or accountability, about whether beauty justifies forgetting or demands remembering. Kykuit will continue to stand on its hilltop. Tourists will continue to admire its terraces. And somewhere in archives and monuments and labor histories, the children's names will continue to exist, waiting for anyone willing to connect marble fountains to tent colonies, garden expenditures to mining wages, architectural excellence to the human beings whose suffering funded it. The sun sets over the Hudson River, casting golden light across Bosworth's terraced gardens. Shadows lengthen across fountains and sculptures. Security lights flicker on as darkness settles. The 6-story stone villa glows against twilight sky. From the highest terrace, you can see for miles the river flowing past, the valley darkening, the distant city lights beginning to emerge. It's beautiful, undeniably, achingly beautiful. And that beauty, like all beauty purchased with empire's profits, carries weight that numbers alone can't measure, costs that ledgers can't record, echoes that silence can't erase.